Sargon of Akkad has started a new movement which he has termed Liberalist. This is a move to take his work online into a more serious political arena. He has created a website, a subreddit, a Facebook group, and intends to organize his support into a movement. I'm going to start by saying this is a good thing for Sargon to do. An organization with a clear direction is always more effective. So on this point, I do congratulate him. However, there are several major flaws with the principles on which he intends to base this movement. Now, I do agree with some of the things that he is fighting for, but there's many that he is lacking in order to launch a successful counter-movement to the progressives. I'm not going to criticize him for becoming collectivist after he's harped on collectivism so much, because I don't believe that's what he's doing. He's standing up for individualism, which is a problem I'll be addressing later, but forming a collective to do so is not necessarily collectivism. Sargon has made several videos so far on what he intends to stand for. To sum it up here, his major principles are individual rights, democracy, economic freedom, freedom of speech, self-reliance, blind justice, and secularism. There are 4 major flaws which I've found with Sargon's liberalist movement. I'll explain what is wrong with it and what approach I would take as an alternative. Number 1. This movement is not new. Looking at a few of these principles, there is not much of a difference between what Sargon is saying and what an establishment conservative politician would say. It's not that things like economic freedom, freedom of speech, and blind justice are bad. It's that there are already many right-leaning people out there arguing for this. These seem like something you would hear from the Republican Party in the US or the Conservative Party in either Britain or Canada. So I don't really see who the target is, since these principles are readily available in mainstream politics. This is what the right has been saying for decades, and it is a failing strategy. It has been so ineffective to push back against the tide of progressivism that you can now get fired for acknowledging the existence of biological gender, or you can get arrested for tweeting about Islam. The reason I started my channel was to both expose the ideology of the left and introduce new right-wing counterpoints. My target audience is generally disgruntled conservatives or those who are undecided, with my goal being to turn them away from the conservatism of the mainstream political parties and toward more reactionary ideas such as traditionalism and nationalism. Because the Reagan-esque approach that they have taken for decades has been a failure. It has failed to stop the progressives from ransacking the civilization that I love. If things don't change, they will continue until the intersectional feminist dystopia is here. If the right is ever going to make a pushback, it must change. We need to change the direction the right has taken for decades because it has not worked, and unfortunately, I feel Sargon's liberalist movement is more of the same. Number 2. This movement is reactive, not proactive. Most of these principles are negative rights, meaning they are a restriction on certain government actions. Freedom of speech means the government cannot censor opinions. Freedom of religion means the government cannot mandate religion. The right to property means the government cannot confiscate private property. The problem is that these principles are only tools to oppose certain actions and not a push for anything independent. Sargon said in the stream that his liberalist movement is a reaction to identity politics. The problem is that it seems to only be a reaction. They don't seem to have a vision or a goal for anything to progress towards. For example, without referencing progressivism, Islam, the alt-right, or any other ideology, could you give a good speech proclaiming liberalist values? Other than to oppose other forces, how could you motivate someone to be a liberalist? This movement's only purpose seems to be reactive. This only seems to be in opposition to censorship, identity politics, socialism, or any other such actions of the progressives. It doesn't really stand for anything alone. I've tried to make it a point that my channel is not just an anti-SJW, anti-progressive channel. It is a traditionalist and nationalist channel. I stand for having a clear moral good, a set of virtues, and a pride in a history and a culture. This is what I fight for, because at the end of the day, you won't be defined by what you stand against, but what you stand for. Number 3. Sargon does not understand his own principles. There was a part in the stream where Louis Laval said, "There are people going against centuries of tradition," and another when King Crocoduck said, "These are the principles of the English Enlightenment." I freaked out a little when they said this. I don't know how else to say this, but it triggered me a little. These guys are going against tradition. These guys completely reject the entire foundation of the ideas of the English Enlightenment that they claim to be deriving these principles from. They seem to think these ideas exist in a vacuum and have no historical basis. They reject the values that were in place that allowed for the English Enlightenment to happen. I could support the kind of liberalism that was present in Britain after the Bill of Rights of 1689, which lasted till about the Second World War. There was freedom of speech, parliamentary elections, and a prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, and the king was prohibited from imposing taxes without the permission of Parliament. While they had these Enlightenment values, the monarch was still seen as the ruler of the state. The Church of England was still the dominant cultural force. There was a clear sense of moral good and a clear British identity. They had a strong sense of nationalism and a loyalty to their king, country, and God. Of course, there were many changes in Britain between the Bill of Rights and the Second World War, but these pillars on which society was based, which allowed for liberal values to exist, remained intact. This lasted for centuries. Over this time, Britain became the most powerful nation on earth, the first to industrialize in the world, and built the greatest empire in history. When liberalism was successfully implemented in Britain, it was never meant to replace the culture that preceded it. On a side note, I live in Canada, and I view my country and Britain as very intertwined. We are both from the same homeland, share the same monarchy, share the same history, and we're part of the same empire. I'd advocate for the same thing here that I would in Britain. So I really doubt it when they say that they're basing this movement on the English Enlightenment, since they only want the results and not any of the context. I'd say they're basing it more on the later, more radical Enlightenment in the 18th century. Sargon is a fan of Thomas Paine. Paine actually did want to remove the societal foundations as he was opposed to monarchy and Christianity. I'd say an accurate implementation of this brand of Enlightenment was the French Revolution. In the French Revolution, they did remove the preceding societal foundation. The monarchy was removed and the Catholic Church was banned, and it was replaced by this weird new religion called the Cult of the Supreme Being. They even replaced the calendar with a new French Republican calendar. The French Revolution led to the Reign of Terror, where everyone thought to be an opponent of the revolution was beheaded. It could be considered the world's first totalitarian regime, which was anything but enlightened. The problem is that these guys seem to think that these liberalist principles can exist alone and independent of any other values or culture. Looking back at Britain, most of the societal pillars have been removed over the last few decades. The Queen is now seen as more of a celebrity than a ruler. The Church of England has lost any influence. The British cultural identity has been destroyed, and there is no longer a sense of belonging to a great nation. Today, there are hundreds of returning ISIS terrorists roaming the streets, while the mayor of the capital city is more concerned about mean tweets. There is now Islamic enclaves in major cities which enforce their own rules. Grooming gangs assaulted thousands of young girls, and the police refused to stop them because they were scared of being called racist. You can now get arrested for social media posts. Islam has become the most prominent religion. Companies are imposing policies which discriminate against native Britons. Kids in kindergarten are now being told to choose their gender identity, and the leader of the official opposition is a fan of Marxism. None of this ever would have been allowed to happen in the traditional Britain. The removal of Britain's societal foundations has created the Britain of the SJW, the very thing Sargon wants to fight today. Things like freedom of speech, right to property, and individual rights are not values. They should be the result of good values. Prudence, justice, temperance, and courage are good values. A society that has them will appreciate free speech, individual rights, and property rights. Progressives don't value prudence, justice, temperance, and courage. They value equality. They didn't just decide one day that they are against freedom of speech. They just disregarded it when it was no longer necessary for them to achieve their vision of equality. You can't have principles that exist in a vacuum. In order to have any of the liberalist principles that Sargon wants, you need to have a society that's values reflect them. If you don't, that society will disregard these principles the second they are no longer convenient. Number 4. This strategy is suicidal. The principles and plan on how to run a society set out in this stream only work in abstract. If implemented in practice, they would undoubtedly fail. A purely individualist society would only work if everyone in that society agrees to be an individual. The second that a group decides that they want to be a collective, which according to your principles they are allowed to do, they beat any individual. It's only a matter of time before an individualist society is overrun by multiple collectives. This is because civilizations are collectivist. Individualism can only exist if the civilization is advanced enough to allow for it. There needs to be some common identity in a civilization because there needs to be some reason for the individuals to sustain the society for future generations. For example, if I lived in 19th century Britain, I would gladly stand up and fight for Britain because it was something great. It would have been a culture and a history that I would have wanted to survive long after my death. In 19th century Britain, they had many of these individual rights, such as freedom of speech, right to property, parliamentary elections, but there was a collective identity that they fought to preserve. It wasn't just about these rights, but it was for a king, a country, and for their God. The idea that the individual be placed above Britain herself would have been insane. In the context of a liberalist, purely individualist Britain, I wouldn't care what happened to it after my death. There is nothing to make me feel like I'm part of something bigger, so I'd have no reason to fight to maintain it. And honestly, I think that's what's happened to us in the West. Sargon has said that he's strongly opposed to identity politics. You can be against it all you want, but the reality is that identity is a massively powerful tool. The left has used it to perfection over the last few decades. Sargon has stated that this movement is also in opposition to the alt-right and white identitarianism. I myself am not a huge fan of racial identitarianism either, since it is dangerous, but the right needs something that people can identify with. I'd be happy if it weren't racial, but shunning identity as a whole is suicidal. There needs to be an ethos to this movement. Here's an example. There's a politically undecided 18-year-old entering his first year of university. Let's say that one of his professors is Michael Isaacson. Now, you and I might cringe listening to a Michael Isaacson lecture, but to a malleable 18-year-old being told that he's being oppressed by a fascist, white supremacist patriarchy and that it's his job to tear it down, this sounds like a cause he could get excited for. If the same 18-year-old watched Sargon's Liberalist stream, he'd probably stop watching it within 10 minutes out of boredom. I really enjoy Sargon's This Week in Stupid series, but when he talks about the things he actually wants for the world, it's boring. I'm sorry to say this, but this 2-hour-long stream on his liberalist principles was incredibly boring. I didn't feel at all that this was something I wanted to be a part of. On the other hand, when I listen to someone like Braving Ruin or the Distributists, who aren't necessarily alt-right but are on more of the reactionary side of YouTube, talk about their vision for the world, they're inspirational. I get excited for their vision. I feel like I want to go out there and fight for their cause. That is what the right needs. And it's my hope that with my channel, I can get people to see that there exists a great culture out there that they can identify with, and that it's one that's worth fighting for. Going back to that 18-year-old college student, will telling him what's wrong with Michael Isaacson's vision for the world be enough to make him care? Will he really care about the loss of a culture he can't identify with? Would he not be more motivated if you showed him a long and rich history that he could be a part of? If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and follow me on Twitter. Link in the description. If you're part of the Liberalist camp and would like to debate me on these issues, I'd be more than happy to. Thank you for listening. Till next time, endeavor.